Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Real Artways Science on Screen. My name is Ian Alley-Seals, and I'm the cinema coordinator here at Real Artways. And we have been privileged over the years to present Science on Screen, which is put on by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. And the purpose of Science on Screen is to pair interesting films that have a connection to science with a working scientist who can bring science to our audience and connect with us. It's a wonderful, wonderful series. And this is our first one that we have done over Zoom in a very unique time in the world. So with that, this is going to be a fantastic talk tonight. We are lucky enough to have Dr. Paola Sacchetti, Director of Masters Neuroscience at the University of Hartford. She's studied neuron development in relationship to Parkinson's disease and the effects of dietary regimens on cognitive function. Paola, thank you so much for being here. Now, this presentation is, of course, in connection with the film that we have in our virtual cinema right now, Oliver Sacks' His Own Life. And I couldn't think of a better film to bring and a better speaker to have than Dr. Sacchetti. And with that, Doctor, I am going to disappear and I will turn the floor over to you. Thank you everyone for coming. At the end of this presentation, there will be a section for Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A section. At any time, you can leave your question, and as many of them as possible will be answered once we get to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much, everyone. Dr. Sacchetti, this is your stage.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you. It's a real privilege and definitely a very different experience to be here tonight with an audience far away from me. But I am, I'm a faculty member for the University of Hartford in the biology department, and I am a neurobiologist. And what that means is that I study neurons and how they function, so brain cells, how they function, as individual entities and as a group of cells, in order to try to better understand when something goes wrong or misfunction in the brain. If we can compare it to the normal situation, we might be able to understand better where's the origin of disease or the origin of the malfunction. You are here tonight because you have, or you will be soon, or definitely you will be in the near future, about to see a very touching movie about the journey, the life journey of one of the most acclaimed neurologists in the world, Dr. Alois Sacks. And he was a source of scientific inspiration and information. He took notes about diseases in a very constructive manner. But he was also a role model. And particularly, this is why I think the movie is very touching and brings to life this amazing sight that he had. He saw in the disease not just symptoms and ways, mechanisms that needed to be cured, but he also saw the humanity, and he saw individuals behind the disease. And I never had a chance to meet Dr. Alois Sacks, but I had multiple conversations with a colleague who actually wrote a book with him. And that was a source of inspiration for me to understand or to hear about the impressive humanity that he put in everything that he did. And so that started to make me think a little bit about my work and how I was approaching science. And it made me think about what can I do with the knowledge that I have to try to reach out and provide tools that are easy access to the community. And so what I would like to do is share, obviously, my presentation. And what I was planning on doing is I'm going to give you an overview of Alzheimer's disease a little bit, and then come to tell you why I started to think about diet and maybe how food can change the progression maybe of some of these neurological disorders. And so many of you, just like me, try to stay up to date. These days in COVID times is really, really difficult. But often you get bombarded in Google or whatever else you're doing by this lovely images. Food, brain food, this best food for brain health. This food can prevent Alzheimer's disease and reverse its effects. Or here you see a beautiful cover of a book about Alzheimer's diet. And this had led me to start thinking about how to reach the community and what could I do as a scientist. And it made me think that food is actually the common ground for everybody. Everybody eats food. Everybody has a different diet, but everybody does. And one of the possibilities is, what does eating different food really do biologically to your system? And that has started to make me think and try to identify or think if there are possibilities to really answer these questions. Are they really diets that are more appropriate to help improve the health of the brain, for example, in Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease? So Alzheimer is the most prominent form of dementia. And as you can see in this graph, in this pie chart in dark purple, this is the cases of Alzheimer's disease dementia compared to all the other forms of dementia. What is striking is that in the right-hand side, you can see a graph with a projection of the next 40 years, or by now, the next 30 years. And we can see how the aging population will increase. But however, in particular in this graph, you see the representation of the number of people who are going to have Alzheimer in the coming years. And in particular, what is striking is in 2015, we have imagined, or we can predict, that there will be about 14 million people who are going to actually have Alzheimer in the US. That's a very striking number and a little bit scary. This disease takes a name from the doctor who identified or described it for the first time. His name is Alois Alzheimer. In about early 1900, he reported of a severe disease that was affecting one of his patients, a woman in her late 50s. And he described her symptoms as memory loss, disorientation, and hallucinations. And any of you had the occasion to be close to an Alzheimer patient, this is clearly the prominent symptoms that any of us would notice. He went a little further. In 1907, he reported, observed the brain of his patient who had by then been deceased. And what he described was very strange plaques and tangles here drawn by himself that he could observe inside the tissue of her brain. From 1907 to now, unfortunately, our knowledge has deepened, but we haven't discovered ways of curing this disease. So what we know is that this disease is a progressive disease, that it starts with mild symptoms, forgetting names, misplacing objects, trouble planning your day. I think many of you right now are smiling or worried about and saying, oh, that happens to me all the time. This happens to me all the time. However, what shortly with time, as time progresses, what the patients and the caregiver notice is that these symptoms worsen. Patients start forgetting the name of their spouse. The risk to become lost, that is no longer one of this mindless event that happens, but it's definitely troublesome and probably very scary for the people that undergo this. There are personality changes, and these moderate changes soon turn into much more severe effect. Not recognizing family members, getting lost in their surroundings because they cannot recognize the surrounding, having difficulty communicating. We all agree, and I hope that you will feel in peace when I tell you that this is not normal aging. The mild symptoms might be normal aging, but the rest, the progression, the severity of it is clearly far away from what normal should be. What we know is that these symptoms are clearly linked to changes that occur actually in the brain. And here, I would like to show you the structural changes, the big gross anatomy changes that occur in the brain. You see two sets of images, both of them very similar. On the left-hand side, we see two sections of brain. In the right image is a healthy patient that passed away for whatever reason occurred. And on the left-hand side, an age-matched section from the brain of an Alzheimer patient. On the right-hand side, it's a similar image, again, an age-matched control, side by side with the Alzheimer patient tissue.
And this is to show you how striking the differences are. I'm sure that just like me, you can notice that the tissue is smaller. So these brain sections are a lot smaller than their age match control. And when we emphasize age match, it has to do with making sure that age does not become a confounding factor. And so also that suggests that this brain is very different from normal aging brain. So it is reduced in size, as you can see. There is particularly a decrease in this little portion, the top of the brain. And in both cases, you can see that that's the part that is missing. We call this atrophy, and it's decrease of the cortex, of the surface of the brain, that allows us to do a lot of three-dimensional thinking, a lot of planning, a lot of higher level thinking. What we can also notice is that the holes inside the brain, the ventricles, become bigger and large. You can compare this to the normal situation. Or here, the enlarged ventricle on the left compared to the one on the right. And last but not least, I want to point you to a portion of this tissue that is highly affected down here. The hippocampus, which many of you might know as the center of memory, and another structure with a funny name called the entorhinal cortex, the center that controls spatial navigation. We can see that in Alzheimer patients, this portion is much more affected than in normal control. So those are big changes that are easily visible, but there are also tiny, minute little changes that can be observed at the microscopic level. Those are sections, thin cut of the same tissue that I just showed you. And again, we are comparing a normal individual compared to the tissue obtained from an Alzheimer patient. And what this thin little sections have undergone is a treatment of color, what we call a staining. They will stain particularly some of the hallmark of the disease. And if we look at much closer at this Alzheimer's disease patient right here, this tissue, you can see, or I will point to you, some unusual observations. We can see this kind of like hair cat bubbles, or here called plaques. We can also observe much darker stained dots in tangles. And what those are plaques made of a protein called beta amyloid. And the tangles instead are made of deposit inside the brain cells of another protein called tau. I will also bring your attention now to this drawing on the bottom, where you can see the plaques and the tangles. And those are handmade drawing by Dr. Alois Alzheimer. And so this is just the current modern scientific proof of what he had observed 100 years ago. One thing that I would like to point out is that normally beta amyloid and tau are actually proteins that are always present in your brain. They have their own function and they help normally your brain to function the proper way. However, in the disease, something happens and they got modified and they start to be sticky and they attach to each other, forming then these plaques or these tangles. What we know compared to the time of Dr. Alois Alzheimer is that fortunately now we are able to look into the brain of live patients and observe these changes, and in particular the aggregation of these toxic proteins into their brain. And so again, I would like to compare to you a healthy individual on the bottom with an Alzheimer patient. This is a live PET scan. And on the first column is just an image of their brain. On the second column is the distribution of tau, one of the two toxic aggregates that we think are linked to Alzheimer. And in the third column is beta amyloid. And I'm sure that you can appreciate how more intensely represented are tau tangles and beta amyloid in the Alzheimer brain compared to a normal individual. But what we also know, and have been able to better map compared to Dr. Alzheimer, is what are those changes that I just showed you, both at the structural level and as well as the microscopic level, how those relate to actually the changes in cognitive function of the patients. And so here it's a little graph where it's pretty much in the bottom is time. And you can see that time is identified as disease progression from a point of view of the cognitive function of the patients. So we have a first for a long period normal cognition. The disease progresses into a mild cognitive impairment state. just little forgetful memories. And then it progresses into real dementia with the severe and with the moderate and the severe symptoms that we saw. And what I would like to point to you is how amazing your brain actually is. During the period in which the patients are still under normal cognition and therefore function perfectly well like you and I, they started to accumulate intense amounts of this amyloid plaques. A little later during the progression, we also see the rapid accumulation of tau. And what is important to notice is that this protein gets pretty high levels while you're still very functional. In the period of mild cognitive impairment, this is when the curve starts changing. And at this point, we also observe those large physical changes in the brain, tissue missing, and enlarged ventricles. However, up to here, the patient is quite functional. And this is due to the great plasticity of the brain, this amazing machine that we have up here that is able to compensate for the little losses, for the little changes for a long time on its own. At some point, unfortunately, it will succumb and the brain itself is no longer able to function. However, the disease has been progressing probably for about 8 to 10 years. And this is when, at the beginning of the dementia phase, when the patient would actually go and seek for help and start going to doctors. And at this point, you can imagine that the disease is 2/3 maybe have progressed, and it's very, very difficult to intervene and do something. So this is why we need to be able to start doing something way earlier, something much more simple that we can do in our daily life to help ourselves, to maybe map a better road to our aging period. And maybe even if we are in a deterioration of dementia, maybe help us do something better and improve this period of lifetime. So to summarize what we know that beta amyloid forms plaques outside of the brain cells. So you can see them agglomerating here. And that disrupts the function of the cells. We also know that within the cells, there are some aggregates of tau. And again, these internal aggregates disrupt the function of the neurons. We also know that these aggregates of tau can spread, can move from one cell to another, a little bit like a virus. And therefore, this is why the disease progresses through the brain. And last but not least, we also know that these aggregates start to create like a chronic inflammatory state within the brain that makes the brain quite unhappy and difficult for the brain to function, and is problematic. Although we know all these things, we haven't been able to defeat this disease. And although there have been a lot of research done, we have not come up with medicine that can help alter the progression of the disease. There has been about 400 drugs on clinical trial, and these days we hear about what clinical trial is. So they are trying these drugs on different phases, on different amount of populations, both healthy and sick individuals. And unfortunately, none of these drugs have come up with a good solution or a good cure. They help reverse some of the aggregates that we see, but they do not change the progression of the cognitive function losses. And because of all this kind of failures, scientists have started to, or continue to think, are there other hypotheses that we can explore? Maybe beta amyloid and tau are not everything. Scientists have also started to look for new hypotheses or leftover hypotheses that were thought about many years ago and dropped. And among all this new searching, there's been a lot of evidence and a lot of thought in the possibility that maybe neurological disorders like Alzheimer are caused by bacteria or by viruses. And there's been some evidence collected that within the brain tissue of patients who have succumbed to Alzheimer, we can see leftover microbes, viruses, and marks of this type. What does that mean? Well, the brain is exposed to the outside through possibly the nose, but also through what we ingest, and it internalizes into our guts. And so the question is there a possible connection and relationship then between these internal environments that we've always thought were very separated? And so the idea of a pathogen hypothesis for this disease has shifted the attention of scientists to the microbiome. The microbiome is that world of microorganisms, bacteria, fungi mostly, that end up living on us and within us all the time, even when we are healthy. And one of the possibilities is this biome that is present both in our guts, but also in other tissue and the brain too, might be maybe changing during the disease state, or might have started to change due to some impact. What people have been able to do is compare the brain of older and younger individuals with and without Alzheimer, and have noticed that there are viral residues or bacterial residues in the brain. And they have started to think or show that there are maybe changes in the brain microbiome that is shifted during disease state, and that it shifts the brain toward more pro-inflammatory activity. I think that many of us know and are aware that when we don't feel good, maybe in our digestive system, in our GI tract, your brain doesn't really function very well. And alternatively, then when you're really stressed out, and it's all maybe in your head and you're thinking about all these problems, ooh, people don't like to eat, or maybe people get GI tract issues. So scientists devoted some time to try to understand. Maybe we have ignored the fact that there is a connection. And it turns out that in the past decade, we've been able to reveal the existence of a real connection, a real access, biodirectional, that connect the guts to the brain and the brain back to the guts. By doing so, we have been able then to try to study what are the changes that occur in the brain and how they are reflected in the microbiome of your guts, and vice versa. And by analyzing the microbiome present in the gut of Alzheimer patients, people have been able to notice that the equilibrium between all these organisms that normally live inside your guts and allow you to be healthy, that balances shift during disease. There is a dysregulation of this biome, what we call a dysbiosis. And so, you know, with time, I'm a scientist and I think and I read all this news and I started to think, is it really then possible to alter the way we eat and help reinstall this balance in our gut microbiome? And if we do rebalance out this new, this world that is inside our guts, is that then possible to alter the way our brain functions? And if there was misfunction, can we bring it back to a normal state? And one of the curious things that I've started to look with my students is into probiotics. What are probiotics? Probiotics are actually good gut bacteria that can be ingested really easily. And if any of you, like me, have small children, you know that often children get things happening and the doctor is not really being able to identify what the changes is, but he would just suggest, oh, please, take some probiotic. Give your child some probiotic and see if that's going to help. And so that made me think about it. What is the biological evidence behind the possibility of taking probiotics and improving conditions? And could it be that changing the biotic composition, the microbiome of your stomach with probiotic, could that actually have an effect on your mental health? And could that therefore be used in Alzheimer's disease? And now my talk is going to change a little bit sciencey, but bear with me for a second. So what I've done in the lab with my students is ask the questions, can probiotic treatment alter the progression of Alzheimer's disease? And to do so, we have looked at an animal model. This is how we can do it. So we have a group of rodent, of mice, that have been modified to accumulate the proteins that make accumulation and aggregates in Alzheimer's brain, so tau and beta amyloid. And we have looked at these mice and give them daily probiotic and try to look at some of the major hallmarks of the disease. Brain gap, the cells that help the brain stay balanced, astrocytes, and also last but not least, the microglia, the immune fighters of the brain. And what we have looked at is obviously using a scientific method, and I will walk you through this just to explain to you what we've done. We've taken our Alzheimer mice and we have split them into two groups. To a group, ADP, we gave them probiotic, and to their brother and sisters, we gave their regular diet. We treated them for 3 months with this probiotic supplementation. Every morning we went to give them a little cookie wafer with a little bit of probiotic on it. And we treated them from the age of 7 months to 10, which is when the mice start to be a little bit on the older side. We have not given them random probiotic off the shelf. We have given them 2 types of bacteria that we knew from the literature had shown some positive effect on cognitive function. So we treat our mice, and then at the end, we look at their brain tissue. And we look at the neurons, the brain cells. We look at the astrocytes, the one that maintain balance in the brain. And we look at microglia, the immune fighters. What have we found? Well, we have found that in the hippocampus, in the center for memory of these mice, when we give them probiotic, we see a higher number of neurons present in their brain compared to the mice who had been for 3 months on a controlled diet. They have more brain cells. Brain loss is one of the hallmarks of the disease. So our ADP mice seems to be doing a little better. When we look at the astrocytes, the cells that like to maintain balance in the brain, what we notice is that in the cortex, in the surface area of the brain, our ADP mice have less of this balanced cells, these astrocytes. What is important to know is that astrocytes increase in number and change a little shape when they feel that the brain is not balanced, when they feel that the brain is under attack. And therefore, what this is showing is that this hyper astrocytes are less hyper in the case of the probiotic treatment. And last but not least, when we look at the defense mechanism, the fighter of the brain, we see that this number of fighter has decreased in the brain of our Alzheimer mice treated with probiotic. This balance cells and defense mechanism cells suggest that maybe there is less neuroinflammation in the brain of our mice treated with probiotic. And so that made us think and believe that there might be a way to start combating, making little steps against neuronal loss, against the cell loss in the brain. That there is possible ways of treating neuroinflammation, inflammation in the brain. And that some of this answer might come from simple treatments like taking probiotics. And so one thing that I would like to highlight is that probiotics are inexpensive. They're easy to administer therapeutics, and that all of us can take them when things are not going right in a very simple way and with easy access to. But there's a lot of other things that can be done. You don't have to focus on probiotic. There's a lot of other diets, a lot of other type of food that can be eaten. And so one of the other things that is evident from research on Alzheimer is that as much as there is dysbiosis, this change in the microbiome, we have also noticed that the brain is less active. There's what is called hypermetabolism. And here are a series of images again comparing a normal control to an Alzheimer brain. And the more intense color means more activity, more energy, and therefore more activity of the brain. And the more bluish color suggests less energy and less activity. And so we have started to wonder if there are ways changing what you eat to maybe combat this hypometabolism. Is there a way to increase energy in the brain specifically, and therefore maybe help patients to reverse this defect. And we have started to look at food intake. And in particular, we started to focus on a diet called the ketogenic diet that these days is on everybody's mind. People are taking a ketogenic diet to lose weight. Athletes are taking it for better performances. Other people are wondering if anything that goes wrong, you can treat it with a ketogenic diet. What is this diet? This diet is a diet really high in fat, as you can see, fish fat, vegetable fats, a little bit of animal fat. The diet also contains moderate levels of protein, as you can see here from meat, and very, very low number of carbohydrate. No fruit, no bread, no rice, no pasta, okay? Those kind of things are off the diet. And this ketogenic diet therefore gives you pretty much 95% of your calories come from protein and fat and not from sugars. This diet was originally discovered as a possible treatment against child epilepsy About 100 years ago, children that had intense epileptic attacks were brought to centers, to treatment centers, and kind of confined there. And observers noticed that when the children were fasting, they were not provided food. In this period of time, their epilepsy will actually decrease. Fortunately, a lot of research has been done, and instead of starving these children, now we have a possible diet that mimic the changes that occur in the body when you are fasting, but still providing food. And so what we have started to wonder is, can the ketogenic diet alter the energy level in the brain? And in particular, what we have started to look at is a special type of energy that we measured in the brain, actually in the body, called NAD. NAD, some of you might have heard of it because it has been proposed as a possible anti-aging treatment. And so we wonder if there is a link between a ketogenic diet, these energy levels, and we know that this form of energy is linked to inflammation and DNA damage. Inflammation is a mark of Alzheimer. DNA damage is when the cells are damaged, when their DNA is damaged, then the cells are going to die. So neuronal or cell loss is another mark of Alzheimer. And so we started to treat our little mice with a ketogenic diet and started to measure energy levels and then look at inflammation and DNA damage. And what we have been able to observe was that by taking the ketogenic diet, the mice had a metabolic shift. And here is just a representation of that. And before I walk you through this, I would like to tell you that what happens is that normally you and I, when we eat carbohydrates, sugars, our body uses mostly glucose to provide energy. And in particular, the brain is really efficient at taking glucose and turning it into energy to function. When you change the diet and you give instead a diet that is low in carbohydrates, low in sugar, you induce a state of what we call ketosis, the production of ketone bodies. And so this graph just represented our mice and proves that while we have treated our mice with the diet, their metabolism has shifted and was not actually using sugar, but was using the elements present in a ketogenic diet to function. This also shows that when the line is when we stop giving the ketogenic diet to the mice, quickly these mice reverted back to using glucose. So they were still healthy and functioning like everybody else. So what did we observe with the ketogenic diet? Well, that both young, healthy rats and mice and aged mice and aged diseased mice with the Alzheimer disease, what we can see is in all cases, the energy ratio in the brain increases. So we have a lot more energy available for functioning during the state of ketosis. And when we look at the negative effects that we can determine in Alzheimer, when we look, for example, at DNA damage, we see that our mice, after 3 weeks of the ketogenic diet, have a lot less DNA damage than the animals that were treated with the control diet. This happens in young, healthy rats, and we are now trying to explore if that happens also in aging mice. There seems to be also a hint that the major master regulator of the inflammatory response, the one that turns on everything in order to fight inflammation, is also increasing activity, suggesting that the ketogenic diet might reverse some of this bad aspect that we have noticed in Alzheimer. And so we think that there is simple ways to combat low brain metabolism, that there is simple way to combat DNA damage, and that there are simple ways to improve anti-inflammatory response or to boost the anti-inflammatory response, all symptoms of progressive disease like Alzheimer's disease. And you can do that using, for example, the ketogenic diet. Again, to point out that this changing in diet is an inexpensive, easy way to administer as some sort of therapeutics to try to help combat a very costly and debilitating disease. So in summary, I hope I presented you some evidence that diet, simple things that you and I can do now, but also that we can do in the case of patients with more progressed disease like Alzheimer. The diet can alter your brain health. We can start paving the road now to a healthier aging period, and we can maybe try to help improve some of the symptoms of these patients by using simple treatments like diet and probiotic. We still need a cure. Dietary changes are not going to be the answer against these terrible diseases. But at home, we can do something that might seem to simply help with all our issues. So believe in inexpensive and easy ways to combat. Start eating better food and better health so that your aging process is going to be much better. And with this, I wanted to just bring up the fact that I wouldn't have been able to be here to be picked as representative of the University of Hartford and the neuroscience community if it wasn't for the help of many amazing students who have done research with me in a master program. I would like to thank also my collaborator at Trinity, Dr. Mazzino, which we are working hard on the ketogenic diet together, and Dr. Ruskin. And I would like to bring kudos to the Women Advancement Initiative, the legacy of the Hartford College for Women, for providing a lot of the funding that has allowed me and a lot of these young women to actually do some good science and shine through. And with that, I would like to then open it up for discussions and see if anybody's interested in asking me any questions. So what I can see is that somebody has asked, and knowing that inflammation is a factor in Alzheimer, have you found that people with an inflammatory condition like autoimmune disease are more likely to develop Alzheimer? I think that those are studies that are being done from a public health point of view and from epidemiology. I think that there are some evidence that there are more complications in aging people who have had inflammatory disease. Some of this, depending on the severity of the disease that you are discussing or you're wondering about, some of these individuals, unfortunately, are not going to make it to really advanced ages. And therefore, we might have less good data. But there is evidence that there's, in general, less good functioning of the system, brain included, in case of people that for a long time have suffered from inflammations. And there is a big push these days in neuroscience to try to understand better what is the interaction between immunology and neuroscience. The problem of science, also of the evolution of science, is that often it takes a lot of work to become an expert in a field. And the world of neuroscience is complicated enough, and some of us is therefore left off. Some and are less interested in looking in other subfields. But now we have come to an agreement that we need to get together, and we seriously need to start talking, even within a certain field, and more communication between immunology and neuroscience to be able to set up proper experiments that can answer all those questions. One of the things that is clear is that many of the neurological disorders have a neuroinflammation component. And that for a long time had been kind of dismissed, left on the side, because all of us were focused on what goes wrong, specifically only in the cell of the brain, without looking at the brain as part of a much bigger organism, and therefore an interaction. And last but not least, and again, because hopefully science continues to evolve and we learn more things, we have very recently discovered that there is an open communication between the immune response, the immune system and the brain. There are actually vessels that have been identified only a couple of years ago that can allow exchange of cells and exchange of inflammatory markers and anti and pro-inflammatory markers between the circulatory system and the brain. For a long time, we thought that the brain was a box that was completely isolated from the rest and therefore could never be under attack. And now we are discovering that we just did not know that there was some sort of open communication. And so a lot more research is picking up now to exactly answer those kind of answers. What is the role of inflammation on the normal functioning of the brain? I hope this answer. And I see another question as, if someone is diagnosed with Alzheimer, can probiotic and diet help at a point, or is it too late? Do the diet change needs to start before any disease activity has occurred? So I do not have the exact answer, but from what we see in our data, it would suggest that at least in mouse models, that even if the mice already have the disease, they progress at a slower pace than their counterparts who have not been treated with diet or with probiotic. So is that too late? Unfortunately, as I show you, by the time the patients are exposed, are able to get in contact with a doctor, the disease has progressed already for several years, and therefore the damage that those 8 to 10, maybe 15 years have done is a damage that cannot be reversed. But maybe we can slow down the progression, and sometimes exactly if we are now able to detect earlier some of the first symptoms or the first sign of Alzheimer, and we are maybe just in the 4th year or the 3rd year of the disease, maybe some of these little changes allow then the disease, instead of progressing in an exponential way, to actually tame down the curve and allow the patient to be much more functional, normal cognition or mild cognition, and extend that period before they actually hit the dementia state. With that said, I think that if it was me, and this is what I'm trying on my own to start doing, although changing dietary habits are really hard, is I'm starting now to change my diet. I'm starting to make some of these tiny little changes that a little bit of time are easier to do than wait maybe 20 or 30 years when you are, much more advanced and you think, I've lived this far, I can continue doing what I was doing. Well, maybe starting earlier might actually help. And if particularly some of these issues are related to inflammation, I think that starting treating inflammation now makes a better body, better mental health now, and clearly a much more productive mental health with years to come. Another question that comes is, are there many forms of probiotics out there? Yes, they are. Pills, kefir, kombucha. Do you have a recommendation for the best sources of probiotic? So one of the things that I would like to highlight is that I have started to get into this type of research, mostly because I was a little worried about what I was hearing. And by doing a little bit more digging in the literature, what is clear is that some of these treatments, particularly the ones that are out there, are a little tricky. So 2 aspects. One of it is the ones that are easy to find on the shelf through pills and so forth are just made of bacteria that are easy to grow in the lab. Those might actually not be the type of probiotic, for example, that I give to my mice. We were very careful. We give them very pure colonies to limit, instead of giving them a big concoction that we couldn't figure out exactly who was maybe the cause of the amelioration or not. And so I would like you to be careful with that, because some of the ones over the counter are actually as good as palliatives. But there are now some forms that are being commercialized that are like the lactobacillus that I was showing you in the slides, that have been shown to really have specific effect on brain health. One of the other things that I discovered as I was doing this research, and we're all learning as we go along, is that a lot of doctors are doing research in very other different fields. And what seems to be the common agreement is that some of these treatments are not good in a moment where you are in healthy conditions. Some of this treatment should actually be taken, and I'm talking specifically about probiotic, in a moment where there is a dysfunction. Because the healthy condition is normally given by a balance of all the biomes, by all this microorganisms that lives in your guts. And if you disrupt their normal status, you kind of see what maybe you might see in Alzheimer's disease, a dysfunction. Pretty much the biome are always constantly at war with each other to try to keep each other in check. And there's an equal, there's a specific proportion of each one of these different type of organisms that should be present. And when one takes over compared to the other, you can see some dysfunction and some issues. And so what we want to make sure is that, yes, I encourage you to change your diet and use probiotic or some of the other treatment, but I would like you to do your research before you do that. And there are good sources even on the internet. If you look at the CDC, if you look at the National Institute of Health, about advices, the Mayo Clinic also advices on what are good probiotic and good gut composition altering tools that can be used. So some of the pills off the shelf, but it's true that kefir and kombucha are natural products that can help you maintain microbiome health, and therefore in some ways are maybe better than just taking a pill. You said that you also researched Parkinson's disease. Have you found that diet and probiotic can help with Parkinson's as well? So the answer is yes, but not from me. So I, for many years, studied Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and in particular in the molecular mechanism, trying to understand how the cells develop with the idea of trying to provide stem cell therapy. I have not myself done too many things, particularly probiotics on Parkinson, but there are evidence out there of studies of dietary changes on Alzheimer patients and on Parkinson patients and on Parkinson models that show that, again, some of these changes might also be effective and helping control, in particular, that inflammatory state that is present in all these neurological disorders. So yes, the answer is, I think that there will be more and more evidence coming out, and I could comfortably say that yes, changing the diet works for most of the neurological disorders, Alzheimer and Parkinson. What my question remains is there a specific diet that works better for Alzheimer patients compared to Parkinson? Is there a form of probiotic that might be more effective in brain issues compared to cardiac issues? And that's where I think the next maybe 10 to 15 years are going to be very revealing about this. But I think that altering the diet and decreasing inflammation is good for all of us. That my children who are 6 to 8 years old, helping them to learn to have a proper diet that maintain inflammation at a low level might be very effective for them throughout their life. Me trying to change my diet and improve in order to try to avoid all these little inflammatory states, it's clearly a good way to go. Does the high fat in keto diet poses other risk? Yes and no. And so one of the things that I want to focus on the fact is that the keto diet is special. It's about high fat, moderate protein, and therefore moderate amount of meat, particularly red meats that contain also fat, and very little carbohydrate. What the research seems to show is that when you do that, it's okay, you're doing good. Also because a lot of the high fats come maybe from like avocados, oils, coconut oil, fish, and therefore we all know that those are also very good for your cardiovascular system. What I want to make sure that people understand that a burger is not a keto diet product. And the reason is it has high fat, high proteins, and high carbohydrates, has a lot of bread around it. And those are the combinations that don't work. You have to keep away the carbohydrates to make a real proper keto diet. The other thing that I would like to point out is actually that the keto diet is really hard to maintain. It's not fun to eat only those kind of products. And so there is a lot of actually research combining scientists and chefs, culinary experts, to try to make the keto diet much more palatable, particularly for children. Most of the evidence show that children are very responsive to the keto diet, but it's very hard to keep them on it because it's not very good. They get tired of it. We all love our breads, we like our cookies. And so those are the kind of things that people are also working to try to make an acceptable and fun diet. All right, last question, I'm open. Do you think that there will be a cure in the next 20 years? If we're talking about Alzheimer, I honestly hope that 20 years is I think 20 years is too long. And I think that given the exponential increase in the type of research that we are doing, I think that hopefully there will be something that is maybe not a complete cure, but a good tool, much closer than that. And I have high hopes that in the next decade, actually, we will come up with something that is productive and that is useful, at least maybe not to reverse the disease, but at least to tame the progression of the disease. And one thing that I want to let everybody know and kind of leave on a positive note is that the research has also shifted on trying to identify this kind of neurological disorders a lot earlier than what we do. Let's not wait when the patient starts seeing the symptoms 8, 10, 12 years in the disease when it's almost impossible to revert. We have tools now, and that's where I think my hope is coming, that we have ways maybe to develop and identify people at risk or people who start showing the first signs of accumulation of this toxic aggregate, maybe much, much earlier. And if we know it earlier, we can intervene a lot faster and therefore improve the progression of all these diseases.
Dr. Sacchetti, this is Alois Alzheimer again. I'm jumping right back in. I would like to thank you so much for gracing our space with your breadth of knowledge about this incredibly important subject. I know we've been communicating for months, getting ready for this. This is very exciting. Thank you so much for being part of our Science on Screen program.
I appreciate it, and I hope that everybody understands that you can all contribute to the best, to your health, and that little steps at a time will make our life a lot better in the long run. And thank you again for this great opportunity.
So everyone at home, from the bottom of our hearts, could everyone please give a virtual round of applause for Dr. Sacchetti? Thank you so much for coming to Real Art Ways, taking part in Science on Screen. And everyone, have a great evening. We're gonna have another Science on Screen next month. It is going to be focusing on CRISPR and genetic engineering, and it is going to be fantastic. And if you haven't yet, please go out to the virtual cinema, the Real Art Ways website, and watch Oliver Sacks' His Own Life. Dr. Sacchetti, thank you again. Have a great night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.